All I require is to sit in the sun, read my book, alone.
I will leave you now to your book.
That is all I ask.
Books, young man, books, thousands of them. If time wasn't so important, I'd show you something. My library, thousands of books.
Hi, my name is Peter, and I'm the host of this Trek Book Club podcast, a member of the BQN Podcast Network. This is a companion podcast to the Trek Book Club on X, formerly known as Twitter, where we read and discuss Trek books approximately every 6 weeks. To learn more about the club, go to @TrekBookClub on X. Before we start the conversation, I would like to thank our Patreon patrons who make this show possible. Listeners, if you would like to help us keep all our shows coming to you, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can join our monthly Star Trek scripts table reads and enjoy our special patron-only shows of It's Green and Amy's Math Moments. Visit patreon.com/BQN to get all the details. If becoming a patron isn't your thing, you can still support the show by subscribing to our podcast, sharing our posts on social media, or leaving us a rating or written review. Thank you for your support. We are recording this episode after Discovery Season 5, Episode 10, the series finale, Life Itself. So this is a warning that we may discuss spoilers, and we will also touch upon different parts of the Star Trek universe. This episode is an author conversation in which I will chat with author Tom Salinsky, who has published a book called Star Trek Discovering the TV Series, the original series, the animated series, and the Next Generation. Hi, Tom. Welcome to the pod, and thank you for joining me on the show.
Thank you, Peter. Happy to be here.
And congratulations on publishing your book.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's a nice feeling to copies. You remember that bit at the end of Back to the Future? You can accomplish anything if you put your mind to it. It's a great feeling.
We ask our first-time guests to give their Trek origin story and Trek novel origin story. So can you start us off with your Trek origin story?
So I started getting into science fiction when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And so I was watching things like Doctor Who and Blake 7 on BBC television. And then I remember picking up from the library or from secondhand bookshops novels by people like Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, a British children's science fiction author, now I think rather forgotten, called Nicholas Fisk, who, if any of your listeners have like 10 or 11-year-old children, I recommend. I don't think they've dated particularly badly. I think they're still very readable. One of the ones that I picked up was a book called Star Trek 4 or Star Trek 6. I can't remember what number it was, but it was one of the James Blish compendiums of short story-length renderings of classic Star Trek episodes. Now, I don't know to what extent Star Trek as a phenomenon had seeped into my infant consciousness by this point, maybe not at all. But I do remember finding these stories very exciting. And it wasn't terribly easy to watch Star Trek. Occasionally, it would come on BBC Two, and I can remember watching a couple of episodes there. But it was the movies, and in fact, the novelizations of the movies that really got me. And then in the late 80s, when Star Trek The Next Generation started, that really kind of hooked me in.
The James Blish novelization, so the TOS episode, was also my introduction into Star Trek and Star Trek literature. So those were the first books I've read as well. So
the only original Star Trek novel I can confidently say that I've read, I think actually was one of the very first, but I do remember it making quite an impact on me, and that's Trek to Mad World.
Okay.
Which is another one of those, the Enterprise meets a quixotic alien with godlike powers. But it has a very, very neat punchline, which I remember being very impressed by.
Let's talk about the book that you've written. How did you think about writing that book? How did you start it? And how did you approach watching all of Star Trek?
I recently completed a podcast project, which also became a book, called Best Pick, in which, with two friends, we worked our way through every movie that had won Best Picture at the Academy Awards in an order determined by pulling them out of a hat at random, just to keep it interesting. So that sort of completist-ism is definitely in my DNA somewhere. That was a great idea for a podcast, but the problem is you run out of films eventually. So that podcast is currently resting while we think of something else to do. But in the meantime, I was just idly thinking, how much Star Trek have I seen? Because like I said, I didn't see much of the original series. And then, in fact, watching The Next Generation wasn't terribly easy. My earliest encounters with The Next Generation were renting VHS tapes because it hadn't come to British television yet. It would take about 2 years for it to come to British television. And then after about 3 or 4 years on the BBC, Rupert Murdoch's Sky Television bought it. And that meant you could only watch it in the UK if you had a satellite dish, which about 20% of UK homes did. So it was hard to keep up with it all. But I eventually, some years ago when they came out, I bought the Next Generation Blu-ray when they came out and in season box sets. So I'm pretty familiar with that. And then I'd watched some of Voyager and some of Deep Space Nine, and I'd be keeping up with the more modern stuff. But I thought, this is such a cultural behemoth. It casts such a long shadow over all sorts of other things. And as a devoted science fiction fan, why haven't I sat down and watched it? So then I did a bit of spreadsheeting. And what I discovered was, if I started watching the original series on the 1st of January 2022, and I watched one episode a day in strict release order, then I would finish watching Enterprise on Christmas Day 2023. And that seemed too neat, too perfect not to attempt.
That's a nice way to celebrate the holidays there.
There you go. Yeah. So that's pretty much what I did. And I think if you're going to do a project like that, it is helpful to tell people you're doing it, because that helps kind of keep you on task. So there were little one-line daily tweets, and then I would put some, often I think fairly rapidly written and disorganized reviews on my blog. And then about 6 months into that process, I just happened to see a friend of a friend on Facebook saying, do you have an idea for a non-fiction, science fiction, telefantasy tie-in book? Because my publisher is looking to diversify and is hearing pitches. And I thought, well, I mean, I've got all this material here. Why don't we see if that could be a book? And they said yes, amazingly. So then all the rather hastily written stuff on the blog had to be rethought and rewritten and streamlined and expanded and condensed and so on. Because there's a big difference between what I'm willing to throw up on a blog for free and what I'm happy to charge people 20 quid to read. But gradually we got it done. So we reorganized things a little bit because, like I said, for the original project, everything was in strict release order. So that meant that early episodes of Deep Space Nine were interleaving with later episodes of Next Generation. And the later movies are having to be dropped in when they came up. But to make it a more convenient reading experience for the book, the first volume is the original series, the animated series, the first 6 movies, and the Next Generation. And then everything else will be covered in a later volume, or possibly 2 later volumes, because actually there's a lot more material post All Good Things than there is pre.
Maybe we'll just start off at the beginning. One thing I enjoyed reading was the historical context of the show and how it was formed. There were challenges at the beginning of TOS, during TOS, beginning of TNG. Maybe you could talk about how Star Trek became available.
Yeah, it's almost always been a struggle. It was very difficult to get the original series on the air. No one had done anything quite like it before. It took a lot of tenacity from Gene Roddenberry, from Lucille Ball, who was paying for it, and from Herb Solow, who was her executive, who was in charge of taking the crazy ideas that people like Gene Roddenberry and Bruce Geller brought and actually getting them into TV studios. And no one had ever done a show like Star Trek before. Science fiction was thought of as for kids. CBS heard the pitch and strung Gene Roddenberry along for quite a long time before eventually going on to commission Lost in Space instead. And the difference between the two shows is stark. But what Gene Roddenberry wanted to do was very simple: to do a science fiction series that treated the spaceship the same way that a cop show would treat the precinct, or a Western show would treat the saloon, as a real environment, a place which felt authentic. And that sounds like a very trivial thing to do, but it hadn't been attempted on television before. And we're talking making 30 odd episodes a year for a few hundreds of thousands of dollars and at an incredibly rapid pace. It was a very, very difficult show to produce, which is why NBC tried to take it off the air at the end of every season, and then eventually succeeded at the end of its 3rd season, by which time they'd also got rid of Gene Roddenberry, who was a royal pain in the ass.
I've heard about the letter writing campaigns at the end of each season, and they were able to save Star Trek for a couple of seasons, but couldn't at the end.
And there was a similar story with Next Generation because the movies had been a success, but again, Gene Roddenberry had been booted off those for being a royal pain in the ass. But he still had some cachet, and his idea was to free himself from the lavish salaries asked for by people like William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, and do it his way, decades in the future, and create a whole new ship, a whole new crew, a whole new set of characters. And people thought he was nuts.
Mhm.
People said Star Trek is Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy, and you can't do it without. And he was very nearly proven right because Paramount, who was paying for it, couldn't find a network. There were really only 3 networks. I think Fox had either just started or was just about to start, but it was NBC, ABC, and CBS, and they all turned the show down. So in order to get it on the air at all, Paramount had to stitch together a virtual network by doing something like 60 or 70 individual syndication deals, going to local stations and saying, do you want the new Star Trek? And they had quite a big bargaining chip because even in 86, 87, when these deals were being done, reruns of the 60s show are still very popular. And of course, Paramount controlled the rights. So they were able to say to these local stations, do you want to keep running the old Star Trek? Take the new Star Trek. And then it's only really when Next Generation got into its stride, that's really the only time that Star Trek was a hit with the fans, a solid commercial hit, putting in big ratings and making big money for the networks, and a critical success. It really didn't happen at any other point in its history. No one was watching in the 60s. It became a hit in syndication. And then after Next Generation, none of the 3 follow-up spin-offs, even though they all have their fans and they all have their virtues, none of them were able to recapture the same kind of cultural groundswell, let alone the ratings of Next Generation. Basically, Deep Space Nine and Voyager have about half the ratings of Next Gen, and Enterprise about a third.
Right. By the end of Enterprise in 2005, and there was a pause in Star Trek TV. It was interesting what you said about syndication of TOS and the beginning of TNG. That was the era in which I discovered Star Trek myself. I discovered it in the early 80s. TOS was my first Star Trek. I watched it at midnight in my local TV syndication station. And I remember when TNG was announced and before it was aired, and even during the first season, it was a bit rough. I remember reading newspaper articles and reviews of Encounter at Farpoint. And like you said, there was uncertainty whether a show with that premise can succeed, because at that time in 86, 87, people associate Star Trek with Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, Scotty, and Uhura, Chekhov, and Sulu. And whether that premise can be successful with a totally different cast, crew, and look wasn't a given.
I think we look back on season 1 of TNG now, and we compare it to TNG seasons 3, 4, 5, and 6. But no one was doing that. They could compare it to anything at all. They were comparing it to TOS. And it is, I think, fairly undeniable that TNG looks an awful lot better than TOS. One of the remarkable things, I think, is that in 87, when TNG started, TOS was like 20 years in the past and looked dated as hell. It doesn't mean that the stories aren't enjoyable, but it does not look contemporary. Weirdly, even today, I think TNG looks fantastic. Little things like going for touch controls just make a huge difference to how successful it is as a vision of the future, in a way that Star Trek, the original series, as much as I love it, looks like the 60s. And yes, there definitely are things about TNG that look like the 80s and 90s, but it is a credible picture of the 24th century in a way that I think you have to really squint at TOS to say it's a credible depiction of the 23rd century.
Not
that it was the 23rd century when those episodes were going out. One of the little things I found out is that the first mention of the 23rd century is the opening titles of Wrath of Khan.
Okay.
The first time it's specified.
That's when we finally knew that it was taking place at that time. What are your thoughts on the original, the first show? Any favorite characters or a favorite episode or a type of episode that you enjoy?
So the thing that really stood out for me, one of the things I was kind of expecting that there would be some episodes that were a bit goofy and some episodes which would be really impressive in terms of their science fiction concepts. And the thing I'd slightly overlooked, which was, with hindsight, dumb, but I had, was how important and how effective that central trio would be, and the relationships between them. And this is true, I think, of a great many long-running series. We come for the premise, but we stay for the characters. And that's a huge boon, because if you like the characters and you like the actors who play them, then even if this week's script is a bit ropey, you'll still have a good time because you're hanging out with your mates. And it's really interesting, I think, to compare Jeffrey Hunter in The Cage to William Shatner in the first series of TOS, because William Shatner's got a fair number of little kind of acting mannerisms which are easy to imitate, which is all good fun, and who doesn't? But I think he's become so easily imitated. We had this sort of parody version of Captain Kirk in our heads, and watching those actual original episodes, particularly the first series, is a useful corrective to that. But I don't know if Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Pike would have been able to sustain 3 years and 79 episodes without some major retooling. As when I watched The Cage, which I watched on like the 29th of December as a little kind of preparation, a little bit of pre-mission homework. Now, that episode is often cited as too cerebral, too sort of highfalutin, it was too good for TV. And I get what the people who give it that description are saying, but for me, the reason it didn't entirely work is not because it's highfalutin science fiction concepts. I'm here for those. It's that there was no warmth between the characters. And Pike looks as if, he explicitly says, he's sort of burdened by the weight of command and is looking for a way out. And then when he's captured and Number One and his various colleagues are sitting on the ship trying to decide what to do, they just sound like they're trying to solve an intellectual problem. They don't care that their friend is trapped on this planet and they can't reach him. There's no emotional connective tissue there. Compare that to, for example, a moment I love in The Devil in the Dark, where Spock, who has been the one urging that the creature be preserved as it might be the last of its kind, suddenly switches to Jim shoot it because he's suddenly terrified that his friend is about to be killed. That's really good stuff. That's really kind of deep character work, much more than you get out of a Mission Impossible, let alone a Lost in Space. So it was that really pulled me in, and it was that sustained me through some of the ropier episodes.
Maybe some of the season 3s.
Exactly, yeah. But it's also, I'm not a big fan of the J.J. Abrams films, and one of the reasons I'm not is because the Chris Pine Captain Kirk is the parody version to a large extent. And you watch an episode like Balance of Terror, and what you see is not we come in peace, shoot to kill. It's this calm, reasonable diplomat who is always looking for solutions and who's always keen to hear other viewpoints.
You mentioned the triumvirate of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and that was also one of the reasons why I like TOS. TOS is my second favorite Star Trek series after DS9, but a very close second. Those three characters and their friendship, relationship, and how they balance each other out was very well done. Later Star Trek shows tried to do that, but I don't think it was as successful as the original version. And you mentioned with Captain Kirk, I think, like you said, by now we've seen the parodies of other people trying to do their Captain Kirk impersonations. But when I go back and watch TOS and just focus on Captain Kirk, he was a really good, fair, commanding captain material, leadership, but he was also sensitive and supportive and warm.
There's just something about the fun that William Shatner seems to be having in the role, which is so refreshing after watching The Cage.
Do you have one or two episodes that stand out from your perspective?
I mean, the obvious ones. I mean, it's very hard to beat City on the Edge of Forever. That's just absolutely gangbusters. I already mentioned Devil in the Dark. Balance of Terror, again. Amok Time, I think, is brilliant. The ones you'd expect me to say. I mean, one that I think I'm supposed to like more than I did, and James Blish is to blame for this, is Spectre of the Gun.
Oh, okay.
Because I remember the James Blish version very clearly, and the end of that is the crew have to convince themselves that the completely authentic Western town they're standing in is in fact an illusion. That works very well on the page. It works rather less well on the screen when the completely authentic Western town is a handful of flats on the Planet Hell soundstage, which doesn't look the least bit convincing, which is a bit of a shame. Like I said, I'm a Doctor Who fan. I'm used to ropey-looking monsters, but they had no choice but to write the budget limitations into the script in that one. And I think that did it a bit of a disservice.
One of my favorite trivia questions in Star Trek relates to Spectre of the Gun, because that was the only time in TOS when you saw the Star Trek font in universe, because it was
really?
it was a really quick scene. One of those storefront panels was
great.
the sheriff's office. The word sheriff was written in the TOS title fonts. So let's go to TAS. Sometimes I feel that show doesn't get as much recognition, so it was another way of telling stories in a different mediums.
I get the impression that Gene Roddenberry would flip-flop between claiming that TAS was canon and that it wasn't canon, depending on what audience he was in front of or what he thought they wanted to hear. But it does seem as if, you have people like Dorothy Fontana involved in it. Obviously, you have most of the original cast back. So it does seem as if the hope was this would be 2 more seasons of Star Trek and would complete the 5-year mission. It is a bit compromised. Again, talking about budget limitations, this is really done on a budget. So much reused animation.
And music.
Yes,
music.
Oh my God, the music is bonkers. I would have been bad enough watching those 20-odd episodes once a week. Imagine watching them every day. That was a very trying month, I can tell you that. But there's good stuff there. Again, the one I'm supposed to like yesteryear didn't quite knock me out the way I think it's supposed to. I think the ones I like the best are the ones that actually lent into the medium, because there's no way on TOS's budget you could have afforded to turn Kirk and Spock into fish people. But in animation, it's barely more expensive than just having them walking on a planet. So why not? Or the Infinite Vulcan, which is the Walter Koenig script. Poor old Walter Koenig, last in, first out, didn't get a chance to appear on the animated series, but wrote a script for it. And I think it's quite a good one. Again, you couldn't do a 20-foot high Spock on the original series with the budget that they had. They gave it a jolly good go with Who Mourns for Adonis, but it's a big ask. But on the animated series, it works great. So those are the ones I like the best.
Piggyback off of what you said, one thing about TAS, because of the animation, all those elaborate starships and spaceships that it would be too expensive to have in live action, they were able to do it. One of the early episodes,
Beyond the Farthest Star,
had all these elaborate spaceships, alien ships. So these landscapes, very elaborate, very colorful. Like you said, it lends well to the medium.
You could have elaborate spaceships, but you can't have them turn.
Oh, right.
Because when they rotate, you have to draw a new version every time. So you can have them crab across the screen sideways, but you can't have them rotate.
Right.
That's too expensive.
And they would have Spock's face cover half of the screen, and then he would raise his eyebrow, but you don't see the other half. And they have all these reuse animation. It was fun, and I think 70s animation in general was that, because, like you said, budget is important.
William Shatner was, I think, recording his lines in local recording studios, or possibly even phone booths, while doing touring productions of Shakespeare and stuff like that, because he wasn't a star. He'd been on this goofy science fiction series for 3 years and was a bit typecast, and so wasn't getting very much film or TV work, but was able to get some regional theatre work because of name recognition, and had to do that in order to keep being able to afford to pay his mortgage, and was completely uninterested in doing any more Star Trek. And his line readings are not exactly dynamic. So that triumvirate isn't really present in those episodes. And that's the thing I think that really disappointed me. If there'd been even a hint of that, I think I would have enjoyed them more. The ones that are fun adventures, I think, work quite well as fun adventures. But there's no depth to any of them, which is disappointing, possibly from yesteryear. And actually, there's one other one. I can't remember what it's called now. There's one where there's a natural disaster coming, and there's quite a thoughtful conversation at the beginning between the Enterprise and the governor of the planet about, do they tell the population that doom is coming or not? That I thought, this is rather kind of thoughtful and interesting stuff for a Saturday morning tea time kids cartoon.
They introduced the concept of the holodeck in one of the episodes. TNG and future Star Trek picked up on that more elaborately, but it started there. And then I remember Robert April was introduced in one of the TAS episodes, and we see him more recently in Strange New Worlds. So
April being one of the names considered, I think, for Pike and rejected.
The music was the one thing that stuck out. More on, maybe not a good thing, but in which Filmation Studios used musical cues frequently, and some of the other shows that they had in Star Trek TAS was also used that a lot. So that was part of my musical soundtrack growing up when I was a kid, because I just remember hearing those cues in all the various shows. Yeah, the action cue and the mystery cue and things like that. Fun times, fun times. let's talk a little bit about the TOS movies, the first 6. What were your thoughts when you were watching them? Any things that stand out?
Making a movie is such a high stakes undertaking compared to TV, because if you're making an ongoing TV series, you've got 26 episodes, you've got 26 chances to get it right. And you can experiment. You can do a Spock episode, a Kirk episode, a McCoy episode. You can play around. But you've got one chance to get it right every 3 years or so with a movie. And you might not get to make another one if this one doesn't work. So it's interesting to kind of watch the rise and fall and watch them figure out what a Star Trek movie is, because there was no template. No one had really done movies like that before. And so the motion picture, the template is clearly somewhere between 2001 Forbidden Planet, which was a big influence on the original series in the first place, Silent Running, stuff like that. It's a bit of a weird one. There's one little insight that I came up with too late to go in the book, and that is, if you look at the production history of the motion picture, it suddenly becomes clear why nobody has a proper arc except for Spock. Because Gene Roddenberry started saying he wanted to do a Star Trek movie, and Paramount was playing around with the idea, and they said, well, Star Trek we think is a television show, so let's explore doing that. And they put a lot of time and effort into Star Trek Phase 2. And then Star Wars came out. They said, no, actually, we will do a movie. And so they took some of the bits and pieces they'd come up with for Phase 2, which was going to start with certainly Kirk and McCoy, and then definitely have William Shatner take a step back. And people like Nichelle Nichols and Walter Koenig and so on would show up if they had nothing better to do, but they needed another set of regular characters, and they assumed that Nimoy wasn't going to do it at all. And so all these bits and pieces are then kind of hammered together to make a script for Star Trek the Motion Picture, which is largely about Kirk versus Decker, which is a sort of weird place to put your emphasis. And then I think like weeks before shooting started, somebody, I think it was like Robert Wise's daughter or someone said, but Daddy, it's not Star Trek without Spock. And Robert Wise made a last-ditch attempt to get Leonard Nimoy on board, and this time he relented. And now somebody had to answer the question, what is Spock's journey through this film? A question which had not been asked or answered for any other character. So especially in the recently released Director's Edition, Spock actually does have an arc through the film, beginning with him on Vulcan and what meeting this machine planet means to him, and discovering that the very thing that it lacks is the thing that he was trying to rid himself of. And because it's not what the film is about, you have to kind of work quite hard to disinter that for yourself. But it is there because somebody had to think about that. But nobody thought about that for anyone else. So the first half of the film is about Kirk versus Decker, as I said. But then basically once Ilea is turned into a probe, that Kirk versus Decker stuff just goes away. It isn't resolved. It doesn't build to anything. It doesn't inform the climax anyway. It just stops because we're now that's all the material from draft 4 of the script. Now the rest of it is taken from draft 11. So the pieces don't kind of fit together properly. And the costumes are drab and it's very slow. But the problem is the characters aren't really there except for Spock. And so you just have to trust that nostalgic affection for seeing William Shatner and George Takei and so on back on the bridge will carry the day. And it made a lot of money. So I think that pretty much did happen. But then Harv Bennett turned up at Paramount's office and they said, what did you think of Star Trek the Motion Picture? And he said, I could do you 6 Star Trek films. You pay for that one. And that more or less proved to be the case.
I think in the motion picture, I found it to be 2 stories. That first half with Kirk and Decker and Kirk adjusting and stuff. And then the second half with Ilea, the probe and that. I've enjoyed watching it, but like you said, it doesn't flow as much. My favorite scene is the Enterprise at dry dock, that 6-minute reveal at the beginning with Jerry Goldsmith's theme. That was great. There was also the sequences towards the end with the Enterprise going through V'ger, which took a while. And I think they were trying to show off the special effects. And like you said, a little bit like 2001, but it was too long.
There's a cut footage around the internet which takes the music from Tron Legacy and cuts together the basic story of the motion picture in just under 20 minutes, which is quite well worth watching. But it does show how much flabbing there is in that film.
And we have the next 3 films, which ended up being a trilogy with The Wrath of Khan, The Search for Spock, and The Voyage Home. So what were your thoughts about that when you were watching those?
I mean, Wrath of Khan is sort of a miracle because on paper, it looks as if it's the same problem as the first film. Somebody came in at the last minute and took 10 different scripts and stitched them together. But the difference is that either Nicholas Meyer is a genius or some sort of divine inspiration flowed through him. But he managed to find a through line that knitted together all those different drafts and make it all feel like one story. And it's a really epic story that really has something to say about what it means to feel redundant and the emptiness of revenge and like big themes and really good science fiction stuff as well. Like the Genesis device is such a brilliant idea. And then, of course, there's that sucker punch of an ending because they went and killed off Spock. And they're even smart about that because they realize that there's an early draft which has Spock being killed, I think, about a quarter of the way through. And they realize, no, that's so big, we should save it for our big ending. But then by this stage, news of Spock's death had leaked. So then there's that very early scene where it looks as if Spock has been killed right at the very, very beginning. But then, oh no, that's just the simulation. It's so clever. And that's the Kobayashi Maru, which again is such an evocative story and a real insight into who Captain Kirk is and his refusal to look death in the face. I mean, it's terrific stuff. It's really, really amazing. That got the full 5 stars from me very, very easily. And I could happily go and watch it again now.
That's also my favorite Star Trek movie. Like you said, there's lots of great scenes from that.
Do you know Nicholas Meyer's technique for getting a more naturalistic performance out of William Shatner?
No. What did he do?
He said, you have to do lots of takes.
Oh, kind of wear him out type thing?
Yeah. The first 50 or 20 takes, he thinks he's Captain Kirk. But after about the first couple of dozen, he just starts saying the lines. And then you get something a bit more natural and a bit more relaxed out of it.
Oh, that's interesting. When I watch it again, knowing that he must have done 15, 20 takes to get to that point in time. And then we have The Search for Spock, in which he came back, and then The Voyage Home.
Yeah, The Voyage Home this time around was a bit of a disappointment. I was expecting to like it more than I did. And I think maybe the thing that stood out was I'd forgotten how un-Star Trek it is. And if you're in the mood for Star Trek, then The Voyage Home is maybe not the one for you. But actually, after I'd watched it and reviewed it for the book, I watched it again as part of a podcast. There's a very, very good podcast I can recommend if you don't mind me plugging someone else's podcast on your podcast, Untitled Star Trek Project, where an Australian and a British guy who are great friends watch and comment along with a random episode of Star Trek every week. And that podcast was a little bit of an inspiration for my project as well. And very sweetly, they invited me on to watch Star Trek 4 with them. And in their company, I think I enjoyed it a lot more. But it is a bit of an odd one. And I think the direction's a bit flat. And I think the plinky plonky 80s romantic musical comedy score doesn't really do it any favors. But when it's working, it's really working. And again, it's about something. The themes aren't quite as deep as the ones in Wrath of Khan, but it's got something to say about conservation, which was something which is very important. And then in Des Moines, there's some great moments. And I love Spock just leaping into the pool with the whales and then doing the Vulcan mind meld on them. That's brilliant. That's very Star Trek.
I always felt The Voyage Home was the Star Trek movie for people who don't know anything about Star Trek.
Yes.
It's more like an introduction.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a way to introduce a potential fan to Star Trek, in which you don't really need to know any background. You don't need to know any past episodes or stories.
Which makes it all the more weird to me that they're still on board the Klingon ship. There's no reason why they couldn't have skipped a year. They've already gone home. They've taken their licks. They've been given the Enterprise back, and off we go. But Harve Bennett, I think maybe because he came from TV, always thought you have to start the next movie where the previous one ended.
Yeah, so that's why they went on this adventure. And then we could wrap up on the movie section with the last two, with The Final Frontier and The Undiscovered Country. What were your thoughts?
Final Frontier I don't think works at all. Very striking to me that when William Shatner gets behind the camera, the ongoing narrative of Kirk being old and clapped out is replaced with him climbing up El Capitan to prove how virile he is. And I just think it's sort of abandoning a great deal that's been built up till then. Star Trek 6 isn't bad. There's lots to like about it. Again, it's about something which is helpful. And it's a nice final hurrah. There's good material for Spock there. But I'm disappointed that Spock gets stuck on the Enterprise playing Hercule Poirot in a murder mystery with really only one credible suspect and doesn't get to go and have adventures along with Kirk and McCoy. But there's good stuff there. I think Star Trek 6 is the one where it feels like they know what the formula is. And that, I think, makes it just feel a little bit rote. It's like, oh, yeah, we know how to do this now. We've done 5 of them already. And it's starting to feel a bit like there's a pattern to these things. Whereas Up till then, it's been a reinvention every time.
Yeah.
Not always a successful one in the case of 5, but they tried something.
Yeah, at least they tried something different. We were talking about the triumvirate of
Yes.
Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Even though it has its own, issues, I think 5 focused on that relationship between the three of them the most for a Star Trek TOS movie.
McCoy, I think, gets pretty short shrift in most of the movies. They're all star vehicles for William Shatner. Often Spock is a key figure. Like I said, he's definitely in the motion picture, definitely in Wrath of Khan. Obviously, he's barely in Search for Spock. And you'd expect McCoy would kind of step up to fill the void. What actually happens is they discover they can use the supporting cast as a gang, which they then go to town with in 4. Because that's the other slightly weird thing. You don't see that gang of characters operating as a team at any point before they steal the Enterprise in Star Trek 3. That's not a thing that happens in any of the television episodes where they kind of come and go at random.
So those are the movies. And then the next part of Star Trek would be TNG, and we talked a little bit about it already, so we can dive more in. They talked about how it came to be, but then season 1 and 2, especially season 1, was they were trying to find their identity, and then it got better along the way. So what were your overall thoughts about TNG?
I think what's really amazing about those early episodes is how much they got right, and in particular, all the decisions they can't get away from turn out great. The evocation of the 24th century, I think, is pretty faultless. I think the Enterprise inside and out looks fantastic. Some of the characters are better realized than others. Some of the actors look more comfortable than others. St. Patrick Stewart is just a masterstroke, something that had to be forced on Gene Roddenberry. There's a big tendency in these like procedural television dramas of all kinds, but especially science fiction, to write characters just as their jobs. What's the doctor like? Cures patients. What's the engineer like? Fixes problems. They're just their jobs. But when you cast an actor like Patrick Stewart, who in so many ways so distinct from his predecessor in the role, then it becomes impossible just to see him as the captain, because you're immediately seeing all the ways in which he is like and is not like Kirk. And he can never be like Kirk because it's such a different performance. Though I was recently reading Patrick Stewart's autobiography, and he says the one acting note that he took from William Shatner is when it came time to record the opening narration, he just felt that what William Shatner had done was unimprovable. And so he more or less copied Shatner's intonation line by line, word by word, syllable by syllable, because he just felt that the way William Shatner had done it, it could not be bettered.
I would agree with that. I still go back to the original William Shatner one. That's the one that pops up first.
In Bob Justman and Herb Solo's book, you can see the memos going back and forth where they're trying to nail down the exact formula for that opening narration. And it's fascinating to see, because we know it so well, we can all quote it. Yeah. It's fascinating to see all the versions that we nearly had that aren't quite as good, right. Or at least aren't quite as familiar.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there is a lot of work. You bring up a good point in general. It's all this behind the scenes work that goes into creating a show like this. We had all the TOS fans. It's become so popular since the 60s into the late 80s. One thing I noticed in the book, and I chuckle a little bit because it dealt with TNG season 1, was when you were writing summaries of the episodes, there was a few Wesley Crusher centric episodes in which he saved the ship. Yes. And you would say the words, "Well done, Wesley," as part of your summaries. What do you think of the Wesley character and the type of stories that they were doing? And
I mean, this is part of the process of creating an ensemble cast for a long-running TV show. And what you hope is that the characters will grow into the actors and the actors will grow into the characters. And in long-running shows, you see this start to happen. You see it happen, especially in comedies. I'm thinking, for example, of MASH, where the characters and the actors grow into each other. And I think one of the reasons why MASH lasted as long, it's definitely a different show by the time it finishes. It's a much broader, more comedic show by the time it finishes. But it was a huge success in the ratings until its last breath famously lasted longer than the war that it was supposedly depicting. But every actor that leaves is replaced by someone who the actor is more like the character. And that just helps bring in a little bit of extra depth. Like Larry Linville playing Major Burns is very unlike the character he's playing. And his character becomes more and more cartoonish until eventually he's replaced by Major Winchester. And David Ogden Stiers is much more like Winchester than Larry Linville was ever like Burns. And so that process, you can see it start to happen. But at the beginning, you're just guessing. Should we have, I don't know, it's like some kind of counselor who's empathic. Okay, who should we get her? Denise Crosby looks good. Should we get a tough security officer who's maybe got some sort of Mexican heritage? Marina Sirtis looks good. Now, hang on a minute. What if we swap those two over? That might work even better. Like, no one knows what the hell they're doing. Putting a Klingon on the bridge was a last-minute decision. That's why there are 9 people in the main cast. It's too many. But at the last minute, Gene Roddenberry said, I want a Klingon. And so then I have to run out and find Michael Dorn. Like, no one knows what the hell they're doing. So, yeah, let's put a kid on the bridge. Why not? We've established that there are going to be families on board because this isn't a 5-year mission. This is an ongoing mission. So no one's going home, although the Enterprise docks at quite a lot of star bases over the years. So maybe putting families on board wasn't all that necessary, but let's gloss over that. And who is the audience for Star Trek? It's 14-year-old boys. Fantastic. Let's put a 14-year-old boy on the bridge. But once you've got a 14-year-old boy on the ship, what do you do with him? If he's just dealing with puberty, that's not going to be terribly interesting. If he's a screw up, then that's not a character which the 14-year-old boys in the audience can look up to. So he has to be smarter than the adults. But that's dumb because he wouldn't be smarter than the adults. It's there's dumb wish fulfillment, and it becomes tropey and it becomes tired in later seasons, and particularly in Deep Space Nine, for all its virtues. There's a habit of any admiral who appears is a nasty piece of work with a secret agenda. It's because they're trying to undermine what you'd think. The admiral must be above reproach, must be someone who's put in long years, will want the very best for the Federation. How do we undercut that? But you undercut it the same way every time. It becomes tropey. So same with Wesley. So I'm just having a little bit of fun. I want to say this is not a slam at Will Wheaton, who I think does everything that's asked of him and grows into the role the way everyone else does. But I think he felt as an actor that he was not being allowed to develop the character, and that's why he left after the first 4 years. And then when the cast slims down, I regret losing Tasha Yar, because I think there was a lot of potential in that character, and I think Denise Crosby does a great job. But it undeniably helps everyone who's left behind that we're down to 7 rather than the 9 we started with.
You made an interesting point about how to balance all the different characters and making sure they have enough scenes and enough things to do. I just remember sometimes with Counselor Troy's role, I really like her when she's the star of the episode. Like Face of the Enemy is one of my
love Face of the Enemy. Yeah, that's
really
fantastic.
Good.
So good they did it again in Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, that's right, with Kira. When Counselor Troy is the star of the episode, she's really good. But when she's not the main focus of the episode, it's sometimes hard for her to get scenes on like Data or Picard or Riker. And so, what
I find fascinating is after she gets put into uniform by Jellicoe, suddenly she becomes able to be used as another kind of interchangeable member of the crew. So sometimes what will happen is there'll be an episode, and we need 3 people to be stuck in a time eddy or on a planet. It almost kind of doesn't matter who it is. Like, who haven't we used recently? Geordi, Data, and Picard, fine. Whoever happens to be conveniently to hand. And it was never Troy until she put the uniform on. And then suddenly it was. And Marina Sirtis proved that she's just as capable as any of the others of hammering out technobabble and being that kind of generic-y crew member role. But she never got a chance to do it in the first 5 years of the show. Something else I identified in the book is you can tell when the inspiration is running dry and they start recycling the same stories. And so you get what I call, this is the story we tell with this character. So you have, I think, one too many Geordi can't get a girlfriend stories, and one too many some sort of alien spectre molests either Troy or Crusher. It's just... that particularly is a bit sort of ick, but it's a bit of a lack of imagination that we have a character who's fairly thinly defined, and there are only a few things we know how to do with them. So we'll just do one of those again. Uncovering new layers of the character is more interesting.
When I was reading your book by season 7, there were these plots repeated or they were sounded familiar, and so I guess that's when it's time. So But before we got there, we could talk a little bit about like season 3, 4, 5, because I think that was the high point of TNG, like the best of both worlds, Yesterday's Enterprise.
I gave every episode a star rating out of 5 and put those into a spreadsheet because that's who I am. And I expected that my favorite season would be probably 4 or 5, and actually numerically it turns out to be 6, which was quite a surprise to me. But there's a really good run of episodes in 6, and that's Troy in uniform, and that's, I think, Chain of Command is in season 6, and that was the only season of Next Generation which on average
Mhm.
had a higher score than a single season of the original series. For a long time doing this process, season 1 of the original series was the one to beat with an average score of 3.75. And a couple of TNG seasons came close, but season 6 of TNG got 3.9 overall. So there's strong stuff in that season. You can feel the influence of Deep Space Nine starting to make itself felt as well. This is pulled towards some darker material, stuff about the Maquis and the Cardassians and so on. It's all starting to have more of an impact.
I just did a quick check. Like Tapestry is another popular
Tapestry.
episode.
Love Tapestry.
That was season 6. I also enjoyed that. It's probably my favorite Q episode in
me too.
In the franchise. And there was Second Chances, Descent. Starship Mine is the
Yes.
Die Hard episode. It's a little bit of a fun
Yeah.
one, but I enjoyed it.
But it's very well done.
And Chain of Command, as you mentioned. So some Relics, that was the one when Scotty returned. Scotty returned.
Come on. Season 6, people. Season 6.
And actually, speaking of Scotty, one thing I forgot to mention during the TOS section, your book mentioned about Scotty in command, which when I was first watching it as a teenager, I didn't really appreciate that. But as an adult, when I rewatch TOS, I see those handful of episodes when Scotty is command, and I said, oh, this is good, and I wish we could have seen more of that somewhere, if not in TOS, but definitely the movies when his roles wasn't as much. I enjoyed seeing Scotty in command.
Bumping his head on bulkheads for comic relief. There's the danger if you create in your leading man, in your Captain Kirk, the best possible version of a starship captain that anyone could imagine. The most charismatic, the most decisive, the most empathetic, then there's a danger that the rest of the crew have to seem less able in order to shine the captain in a good light. And you can see that definitely with Sulu and Chekhov, sometimes with Uhura, rarely with Spock or McCoy, because their job is to give Kirk alternatives, a way which I'm sure would never happen on any real naval vessel. It's the captain and the first officer who are the ones leaving the ship in order to go and face danger. When it's the chief engineer, for whatever goddamn reason, is the one left in charge, he always makes good decisions. And I really appreciated that. And I was like, where is this guy in the movies? He's picking up a computer mouse and trying to talk into it, which is kind of amusing, but it's not that character.
So it was good that for Relics, they brought that back.
A little bit, They turned him into a gas bag, which is amusing. Again, it's not quite the same character, but it's a reasonable extrapolation from the character that we knew. Whereas, like I said, I think what we get in the movies is a bit of a thin version.
Yeah, more of a comic relief one.
Yeah.
To wrap up the TNG section with season 7, all good things. The first true Star Trek series finale, I enjoyed it. I felt it wrapped up a TV show.
By that time, the idea of a long-running TV series coming to an end and that being a big event was an idea that had become more current. Again, the last episode of MASH broke all ratings records and was such a huge television event. Whereas previously, shows had just not been recommissioned. You know, as far as I know, there is no final climactic last episode of Bewitched. Maybe there is, and I haven't seen it, but I don't think there is. They just stopped.
Yeah.
But in the 70s and 80s, it became more of a thing of, no, we're going to go out on a bang. And so in the 90s, that's what happens with All Good Things.
I'd like to talk about the writing process of your book. How did you go through the writing process, the publishing process, working with editors, the operations part of being an author?
So I would take notes as I watched. If I have missed anything or got anything wrong, my excuse is I must have been writing a note about what was happening immediately prior to that when that came on screen. And then I would take those notes and, like I said, do a kind of fairly rough first draft to just get that up on the internet as soon as possible. And then for the book, I had to go through everything and start thinking a little bit more about who my potential audience was. And so that's why I wrote that section about how Star Trek came to be. In the blog version, there's quite a lot of in-jokes, which are just for my benefit. And so those had to come out. And then actually what happened was the original draft was, I think, 115,000 words. And the publisher said, we'd like this to be 90,000 words. And I think we compromised at 95,000.
So I had to go through
I had to go through and take a fair few things out. We forget in this digital age, books are physical things. A publishing friend of mine once said, my job is to buy paper and then attempt to improve its value by printing words on it. Sometimes I'm unsuccessful, The paper I've bought is less valuable after I've printed words on it, and I have failed. But sometimes I succeed, and the paper is more valuable. But they're physical things, and if the book is 20 pages longer, that means it's proportionally more expensive, and that then has a higher cover price, it's harder to sell, and so on and so on. So those negotiations had to take place, and then I had a very good copy editor I worked with who would go through and ask pedantic questions, and we would have friendly debates about that which distinction and other niceties of the English language. And she has an ongoing war on hyphens, which I put in everywhere and she takes out. So these things are sometimes just a matter of taste, but it's useful and just helpful for a reader to be at least consistent about these things. Often there isn't one right way of doing it. It's a matter of personal preference. But if you're consistent, that means that you're less likely to trip up a reader. And yeah, then compiling the index, which is fun. I don't know if you ever had to compile an index for a book, Peter. I do enjoy slipping jokes into the index if I possibly can.
I'll have to go through the index and look out for them now that I know.
There's a few little gags in there.
Yeah.
It was a very pleasant experience overall. And like I said, nothing quite compares to opening a box and taking out copies of a book with your name on the cover.
Yeah.
It's delightful.
Yeah. I would imagine that's one of the, biggest positives and experiences as an author is to have that physical book in your hand with your name on it and say, oh, it's going to be available and out in the wild. Yeah.
And I've written books before, but always in collaboration. This is the first book which has only got my name on the cover.
Oh, okay.
So, okay. Everything in there is mine and mine alone. So I take responsibility for any errors or omissions and take full credit for all of the magnificent insights contained therein.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. And first of many, I hope. So we'll see you.
Yeah, as I said, probably 3, because there's a lot more episodes in Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise combined than in the first 3 series combined. So we're still trying to figure out exactly how that's going to work. But with any luck, Volume 2 will be out summer 2025 and Volume 3 in summer 2026.
Thanks for the heads up, and we'll have you back on the show when we get to that point.
Great.
Talk more about the next few series of Star Trek. Actually, can you give any advice for a Star Trek fan who wants to start a franchise rewatch or wants to write a book?
Yes. Make a spreadsheet. Know what you're doing. I've proven it can be done in 2 years. I think watching everything in release order makes the most sense, but I also know people who go series by series. Like if Deep Space Nine is your favorite, you want to just sit and watch all of Deep Space Nine, then by all means do that. I also know people who've done the original series in production order rather than in release order, and there is an argument for that as well. You can see the evolution of the show more clearly that way, but it's interesting that you picked up on my interest in putting things into their context. And that's why, for me, release order was the way to do it, because yes, such and such an episode might have been filmed first or written first or planned first, but the Star Trek audience saw these shows in that sequence. And that's how the world of Star Trek was communicated. And so transmission order was the order that made sense to me.
Just a couple of questions related to the subsequent series. You watched DS9, Voyager, Enterprise. Give a quick take on those 3 series. What'd you think about them?
So the question facing the showrunners of Voyager and Deep Space Nine both was, how do you make a Star Trek show that's not just Star Trek again? So they had to try and come up with a new premise. And I do find it interesting that the show in which the characters hang out in a shopping mall in space is the one which is about the horrors of war, generational trauma, and bad decisions you can't get away from. And the one about a tiny group of survivors stuck on the other side of the galaxy, clinging to a lifeboat in desperate hope of one day making it home, is the one which has to carry the flag for Star Trek's signature optimism and fun. I don't think anyone would have sat down and planned it out that way, but they are kind of different facets, different reflections of a single aspect of the Star Trek world. And I think next to Next Generation, they both look a little narrow, but what Deep Space Nine in particular has going for it is this incredible depth of secondary and tertiary characters, an incredibly deep bench. And because it's a shopping mall in space, because it's a single location, the world feels much more detailed and integrated and lived in. And there are some really remarkable bits of character development throughout that series. Nog, in particular, really stood out for me. Who could have believed where we take that character. And then the other weird thing about Deep Space Nine is, as well as being the most traumatic, it's also, when it wants to be, the goofiest of all the iterations of the show. What other iteration, apart possibly from Voyager, could have got away with something like Bada Bing, Bada Boom, which is just nonsense, or Take Me Out to the Holosuite. I mean, these are just nonsense. But when they're on song, they work. Not all of them work. I could do without cross-dressing Ferengis, just to pick a random example. Then initially, I think Voyager feels a bit stuck because the premise begins to swamp the show a bit. And the problem with the premise is it really only gives you 3 stories. One is, we're running out of unobtainium. And you can't keep doing that because either you run out of unobtainium, in which case you undermine one of the premises of your show, which is that the USS Voyager is one of the most powerful ships in the whole quadrant. Or you've solved the problem, in which case you can't keep going back to that well. Or it's just Star Trek and they're just visiting different planets, in which case why have the premise at all? Or it's Captain, I think I found a way home. No, wait a minute, I haven't. This might just reflect a bit of frustration on the part of the showrunners, but what eventually starts happening is they just start thinking to themselves, what's the most ridiculous thing we could open an episode with? What's the most bonkers thing we could do that completely, or threatens to completely upend the whole fabric of the show? Let's do that. So you get crazy episodes like, what's it called? Not Operation Annihilate. What's the one I'm thinking of? Where they all melt like wax at the end.
Oh, Course Oblivion.
Course Oblivion,
Yeah,
that's right. Which is it's just complete nonsense, but it's done with an incredible amount of enthusiasm and brio. What I think lets Voyager down is that alchemy where the characters grow into the actors and the actors grow into the characters doesn't really happen, at least with about half the cast. And really good actors like Roxanne Dawson don't really get a chance to show what they can do because no one's interested in writing stories for B'Elanna, especially not after 7 and 9 turns up. And 7 and 9 is brilliant. And that's a fantastic character. And her scenes with Janeway are some of the best stuff the show's ever given us. But again, they eventually start going back to that well over and over and over. And it becomes, this is the story we do with this character. The Doctor's good value as well. But there's a lot of people hanging around being given very little to do. Even Tim Russ, who is a brilliant actor, can't seem to get anything out of the character that he's been given. Tuvok just sort of ends up as being Spock light for the most part, which is really disappointing. Enterprise is different because Enterprise was, let's just do Star Trek again. And I think the big misstep in early episodes of Enterprise is, it's our first time out in the galaxy. We don't know what we're doing. Let's make the whole crew be doofuses. And as I've just finished watching 3 iterations of the show in which brilliant people solve impossible problems and in this incredible wish fulfillment, idealized way, watching a crew of doofuses screw up things which, because I've watched 24th century shows, I know what the answer is just not inspiring in the same way. And then the third season suffers badly from not making any sense. And the 4th season, they start to get it right, by which time they're already running on fumes and then they get cancelled. So Enterprise was not the best possible way to end the journey, but there's good episodes all the way through. With Enterprise, they are fewer and further between. The 2 Mirror Universe episodes of Enterprise, I think, were my favorites. They're fantastic.
Oh, yeah. That's In a Mirror Darkly. And it was probably my number 2 or number 3 favorite Enterprise episode.
Yeah.
So
we even got rid of that dreadful theme ssong for 2 episodes, which is all for the good. And T'Pol's a really interesting character. The trip to the Vulcans in Enterprise is something I had a really hard time with, but T'Pol's a really good character, and it kind of makes me again wish that somebody had more of an idea of what to do with Tuvok, because T'Pol showed that there was more to be mined out of a Vulcan on board a Federation starship, but they just didn't bother with Tuvok anyway.
For me, DS9 is my favorite show. The reason why is what you mentioned before, which is all these recurring characters over the 7 seasons, and everyone had good arcs that unfolded after a few seasons. So it wasn't just like 1 or 2 episodes. Nog and Garrick, Martok and Cassidy Yates and Vic Fontaine. Yeah, I mean, he was only there for the last couple of seasons, but I really liked him as well. There was all these interesting characters and all the Bajoran religion, the emissary, and then you had the pirates towards the end. So you had all these different interweaving storylines, and so enjoyed that as well. Lastly, what about current Trek? Discovery, Strange New Worlds. What do you think about how current Trek is, especially after watching all the episodes up until Enterprise? Yeah.
It's interesting. I'd like to write an article, probably not a whole book, but about toxic fandom, because I really cannot understand, and I've probably been guilty of it myself a few times, certainly with Doctor Who, but the feeling that I didn't like a particular episode of a show, therefore everyone involved in making it did that deliberately in order to wound me and should die horribly as a result. I mean, it's so difficult, almost nauseating to read. And in particular, when it's wrapped up with this anti-woke identity politics. Heaven forfend that we should have a non-white cast member leading our progressive science fiction show that has been championing non-white cast members since it began. I mean, I can't get my head around it. So did Discovery hit the ground running? For me, no, but nor did pretty much any other series, save the original series. I think, once again, the characters grew into the actors and the actors into the characters. And I think they began to figure out what Star Trek modern streaming television series is and could be. And what I think is particularly exciting about Star Trek on television right now is, in theory, there's something for everyone. And if you want goofy and self-referential, here's Lower Decks. If you want it knowing and nostalgic, then here's Strange New Worlds. If you want it pushing the envelope in terms of what Star Trek can be, here's Discovery. If you want it for kids, here's Prodigy. You know, there should be something for absolutely everyone there. And instead, what I see online is a lot of Star Trek fans bitching and moaning that it isn't exactly how they would have done it, which just, to me, simply betrays how hard it is to do anything like this, let alone do it to your exact specifications, and with the hubristic idea that if it were done to your specifications, it would necessarily then therefore be a huge hit with the whole of the rest of the fan community and the viewing public at large. So it's all a bit frustrating and dispiriting, but I've enjoyed watching the majority of the episodes. And I haven't felt anything like the anger that I've seen online. And I like the idea that we could experiment with a cartoon crossover or a musical episode, because why not? Especially when you're getting 10 episodes a year, let's pretend we have 25 and let's have a bit of freedom and let's play around. Let's push the envelope a bit. Again, the reason that I think Star Wars is in trouble at the moment is because, particularly with the J.J. Abrams movies, a friend of mine watched the first J.J. Abrams movie, The Force Awakens, and says it's like someone had lent J.J. Abrams a priceless sports car, and all he'd been prepared to do was slow circles in the car park. You've got to drive it like you stole it. And I think you cannot say that isn't true of Discovery, because Discovery just tore up the rule book, which is why so many fans hate it. But let's not forget, that's what happened with The Next Generation. That's how we got here.
Those are good points. It took me a little while to up to Discovery, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed all 5 seasons, especially the last one, which was my favorite. But each season has its good points. Like you say, enjoyed all the different shows for its strengths and what they bring to the table. So I think the experimenting it, having these different episodes, like the musical one and the crossover one. Lower Decks had ones that focus on a secondary character, on Peanut Hamper, one episode. Earlier in Lower Decks, they also had another episode that focused on the Klingon, T'Lyn. So they were focused all these different experiments. So it was good to do that. I have a suspicion Discovery will, now that it's over and people watch it not week to week, but in streaming in a binge method, might develop great appreciation for it, because I think when you watch it all together, it connects better than having that pause of week to week. So,
and in 50 years' time, people will be saying, "Well, why can't we have proper Star Trek like we had in the 2020s with Discovery?"
Yeah, it's a little like Enterprise. I think Enterprise developed more of a following after it left the air, once more fans discovered it and watched it. So we'll see.
I'll tell you what's really weird about Enterprise, because I watched all of these on official DVDs and Blu-rays. And that also meant I was able to watch all the supplementary material, interviews and special features and so on, some shot near the time and some shot around the time of the release of the DVD. And often you can see a difference in tone. Sometimes when something's been out for a while, the people involved in making it are a little bit more honest about what worked and what didn't. But generally speaking, on all of these things, in any kind of film or television, people try to find the good, and they try to be chipper and upbeat, even if they're saying that one aspect didn't quite fulfill all the hopes we had for it, but we did our best. Except on Star Trek Enterprise, where it seems as if Brannon Braga cannot wait to apologize, abase himself, confess to all of his crimes and wrongdoings. The tone of the special features is extraordinarily apologetic and craven. And I actually think that I might even like Star Trek Enterprise a bit more than the man who was responsible for creating most of it does. It's an incredibly odd tone to strike. That was one of the first shows that would have been going out when you could get instant fan reaction on the internet, which in the early days of Next Generation, you wouldn't have been able to. But by the 2000s, you definitely could. There would have been online fan forums and rec.arts.Star Trek or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, I remember AOL Star Trek Club, which I was part of back in the day. So I enjoyed Enterprise. It has its ups and downs, just like all the shows. But I think it captured that spirit. I call it the spirit of discovery and exploration, which it captured that pretty well. So I think better than all the other shows. Great. Thank you very much, Tom, for your time talking about your book, talking about Star Trek in general. I really appreciate all your insights and sharing all the knowledge that you have. So thank you for coming onto the show. Can you tell our viewers your contact information, where they can find out more about your book, where it's available, and things like that?
Yeah, available now in the UK on Amazon or all good bookshops. Star Trek Discovering the TV Series by Tom Salinsky. And available in America at the end of July, I believe. But again, available for pre-order now. So why wait? Pre-order it now and get it as soon as it is available. And to find out what I'm up to, you can find me on X/Twitter at Tom Salinsky, or my blog is at tomsalinsky.co.uk.
Okay, great. And I'll put some links to where it'll be available in the show notes, so you can use that as well. And then for myself, you can find me at Peter Trek 1 on X, formerly known as Twitter, as well as on Bluesky. I'm also on at Peter Trek 1 at universeodon.com on Mastodon. I can also be found at Trek Book Club on X Twitter, where we read Star Trek books and discuss them approximately every 6 weeks over a weekend. The Trek Book Club podcast is now part of the BQN podcast network. Here is an overview from Amy of the various podcasts which are part of this network.
What shows are on BQN, you ask? Well, here's a rundown of some podcasts you might be interested in. All Good Things, a Star Trek Universe podcast covering all of Trek, hosted by Amy, Mark, Christos, Kelvin, and Kristen. Whether you've got Xbox or Nintendo, check out Bargain Bin Gamer, a YouTube show hosted by Davey, a self-proclaimed gamer who specializes in reviewing and showcasing affordable video games. 2 episodes enter the arena, 1 comes out victorious. Join hosts Joe and Kevin and a guest as they debate which should win the Batleth battle. Grab your popcorn as you listen to Cinema Z, a film discussion and review podcast showcasing films you probably missed but should definitely check out. Hosted by Mark and Matt. Don your apron for The Food Replicator, where Matthew eats and drinks his way through the Star Trek cocktail and 3 cookbooks. Beam Aboard Galaxy Class, a Star Trek Next Generation podcast covering all of TNG, hosted by Steven. In order to not repeat it, listen to History with the Zalagis, a snippet of historical events from around the world, hosted by Chrissy and Jason. For the newest Trek coverage, check out Infinite Diversity, hosted by Chrissy and Thad. Curl up with a good book and delve into Beta Canon with Peter, host of the online Trek Book Club on Twitter, and his new companion, Trek Book Club podcast. Test your Trek knowledge with Treksperts Quiz, a Star Trek quiz show hosted and written by Davey. Whether you're a member of Starfleet Federation or Planetary Union, go check out Union Federation, covering current Star Trek and the Orville, which we all know is really a Trek show, hosted by Kyle, Kevin, Amy, and Haley. Head over to YouTube and watch The View Screen live on Sundays, your Trek-inspired talk show hosted by Kelvin and Amy, with Season 2 starting in September for a 10-week run. Spill the tea with Christos while he discusses current Trek news and events and explores the world of fandom via guest interviews, all with a LGBTQIA+ perspective on What's the Tea About. And for our Patreon members, we have the Hive Mind with monthly script readings. Let's Fly, a Discovery reaction show. It's Green, a cornucopia of topics. Amy's Math Moments, a quick look at math moments in Star Trek. We know you have a choice of podcasts to choose from, and we thank you for listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Thanks again, Tom, for being on the show. And thanks to all our listeners for your support. This is Peter signing off. Live long and prosper.